This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
Welcome, everybody. And I'm Ara Bagdasarian, the board president of ZeroNow, and welcome to ZeroNow Sessions, the future of active shooter response. Based on your feedback from our last webinar in December, we invite our panelists back to continue this conversation about active shooter response today. Just a little background, ZeroNow is a stakeholder alliance formed to drive innovation, awareness, and funding and policy for safe campuses. As a membership-based organization, ZeroNow facilitates collaboration between industry, association, and education partners to foster new solutions to keep our campuses safe and secure. Before we get started, I just want to recognize our sponsors and founding partners who made this program possible. Thank you to Access Communications, Additional Corporation, TELUS Corporation, OmniAlert, IACLEA, VTB Family Outreach Foundation, NASPA, the Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education, and Campus Safety. If you're interested in learning more about ZeroNow or becoming a member, please visit zeronow.org. So we'd like to introduce our, welcome back our panelists for today's session. First, Brandon Rhone. Brandon has been in law enforcement for 17 years. He spent 10 years in patrol, then was promoted to the rank of captain before his retirement. As a captain of operations, Brandon was responsible for the day-to-day operations of the agency and was commander of the SRO unit. Brandon is a certified school resource officer through the National Association of SROs. And today, Brandon shares his experience as Assistant Director of ALICE Training at Navigate 360. So welcome, Brandon.
Welcome.
Chris Grollneck. So Chris is an award-winning retired police detective and one of the nation's highly respected policy experts in preventing domestic terrorism events. Recognized as a leader of police and public safety initiatives, Chris has experience advising the highest levels of government and corporate executives. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Jonathan Kassa. So Jonathan, welcome back. And Jonathan provides national thought leadership and expertise in campus public safety policies and practices. He has led an innovative national initiatives to increase community-oriented safety, security, and victim advocacy in a career spanning over 25 years. Jonathan is a board member at a regional network of victim assistance and was just reelected to another 4-year term to serve as school board director at one of Pennsylvania's largest school districts, where he chairs the Safe Schools Committee. Welcome back, Jonathan. All right, let's jump right in here. Normally do a poll, but given recent events, and Chris, this hits home for you specifically. What can we learn from the hostage situation at the Collierville, Texas Synagogue?
I think we can look no further that in the middle of an incident is not the right plan to garner, or is not the right time to garner a plan. As Rabbi Charlie Crichton Walker said, I hope I said that correctly, in his release today to CBS, he said the training that he received that they quote unquote never thought they would use here, end quote, came in handy and actually saved their lives. Now they took a little piece and part and parcel of several different trainings, semi-run, hide, fight, but mostly aggressive tactics, threw a chair at the perpetrator. It initiated the right time for a police action, a more deliberate action, and it helped end the incident. But the largest lesson to learn is the middle of an incident is not the right time for a plan to be realized that you need one.
And so, how often do we hear the "it will never hear" mentality? How do we combat that "it will never happen here" mentality?
I think the largest takeaways is the outrage perpetrated by national news, written news, word of mouth, outraged parents, concerned citizens, etc. And when we look at I was one of those proponents, right? Welcome to "it will never happen here." And unfortunately, it keeps happening, quote unquote, here. And I know without going into lockdown information, there's 2 people on this panel today that, it happened very close to home. And to include myself, where I was in the middle of an active shooter once in 2010 in little McKinney, Texas. Not so little. But, when it happens is not the right time to say, shoot, I wish I had a plan. What is your return on regret? and what is your return on prevention? And prevention, we talked about prevention last time, but I've been a big proponent for response is part of prevention. You can't prevent something unless you have some type of response plan, because when prevention does fail, you will need to act. And that's what we saw in Collierville.
Jonathan, how do you handle that in your school district? The it'll never happen here mentality. Is it something that you've had to deal with and address?
I think this is along a continuum, and I use this a lot, whether it's K-12 or higher education. We have to look at not only those staff, faculty, the SROs, campus public safety officers who need to know their role and respond accordingly, as well as the student stakeholders and families as part of the wider prevention lenses that we bring to our strategy. But I think it's essential that what is the leadership? What is your school board of directors? What is that cabinet for the superintendent or the president's cabinet in higher education? Do they have a stakeholder who has a direct line, who sits at that table, who can bring these issues forward? That's very important, whether it's an elected official who's dedicated and just knowledgeable. You do not have to be an expert, but it's knowledgeable enough to ask the questions. Are we ready? Are we prepared? Prove it. In this day and age of pandemic and so many other issues and social unrest and priorities, it's easy to fall out of practice, whether it's your behavioral threat assessment team or ensuring that your substitute teachers program or adjuncts, that they are properly trained for response protocols as well. So it's literally top-down, holistic 360 approach.
And so Brandon, how often should organizations and schools train or run active shooter drills? Is this something that should be part of the annual process? What are your thoughts on this?
I think it should be as often as can be, right? So you think about, how often do we run fire drills? How often did we run fire drills, right? There's a mandate in most states that says you have to run at least one fire drill a month. And so that happens. Where we're not seeing quite the same, right? We're seeing some states that now say, or some locations that say, well, you have to run some type of drill, and it could be an all hazards, it could be a weather, it could be a fire drill, it could be a violent assailant or violent critical incident active threat drill. But it's become vague. Now, I will say, with the glass half full approach, that's a step in the right direction, right? We're getting to where it has to be some sort of drill. But I think until we get to the point where if those who, going back to your original question, right, those that don't believe it's going to happen there, right, those that are in the right frame of mind to be prepared, right, they're going to do it even if they're not mandated by legislation. But those that are still in the it's not going to happen here are probably not going to do it because they don't believe it's going to happen there, and there's an option to do it, right? And so to Chris's point and to John's point, I say this all across the country in every training, right? And Chris said it slightly differently, but I say this: when the time to perform has come, the time to prepare has passed. And it's simply that simple, right? And so it should be a priority, to John's point, at the superintendent level, at the cabinet level, at the president's level. It should be a priority to train and drill so that people are prepared to perform.
Well, but the nature of the folks participating today, ZeroNow is really focused on proactive. How do we proactively prevent harm from happening? But at the minimum, so what is the minimum? If what is the minimum standard that schools should be employing to learn and respond to active shooter situations? What is the bare minimum?
I think the minimum standard is once a month. You think about all the other things we do, right? Your high school football team practices 5 days a week at a minimum. Your high school basketball team practice 5 days a week at a minimum. And then there are students who go out and get individual athletes who go out and go get individual coaching to supplement that 5 day a week, right? So you look at the priority about some of the other things we do at a cadence and at repetition. I think a minimum once a month, because we understand, those of us sitting on this panel, and I'm sure some of those that are participating, right? We understand in a stress-induced environment, the only portion of our brain that's available to us for recall is that amygdala. It's that midbrain. And if we're not stamping that card through repetition, we cannot anticipate, or we should not, I shouldn't say we cannot, we should not expect that moment from 5 years ago, that one training you had, to come back to you the day you need it.
So are you talking about doing training and drills every month at a minimum?
Yeah, I think you should be doing them, right? I mean, we do them for a fire today, right? You go to any public school across the nation, and they're running a fire drill once a month. And I mean, let's talk about the large success that we had increasing survivability in school fires across the nation. We've increased that number, right? We've stopped losing mass amounts of individuals in a school fire. Why? Because we trained and prepared them. So I think the minimum standard should be that once a month across the organizational board. Whether you're in education, whether you're in corporate America, you're in industry, across the board, because we know these incidents happen across the board.
Tim has a quick question on that. Chris just spoke. Tim Riker asked, so training who and what? So we're training the administration, teachers, staff, and or students, and what are they being trained in?
I think, to answer the question, yes, right. You have to train top down and bottom up, right? Because if you look at the last school VCI in Michigan, it is abundantly clear. It is abundantly clear. If the students had not been trained in that school, we are looking at a completely different outcome. Now, that is not to take away from the lives that were lost, but it could have been tripled, if not 100-fold, on the amount of casualties in that event, right? And that's from students doing things, right? So you had students, you had staff, you had faculty, you had administrators, you had training happening both ways, right? Top down, bottom up. And we saw exactly how that yielded an increased survivability.
Chris, I believe you had a thought on that.
I think Brandon's absolutely correct. And what Jonathan was talking about, the complete buy-in, there's a couple cautionaries that I would throw in there. And one is, the human factor. We're dealing with one person's linear thought of, we don't need any training, to the other person's thought of everyone needs to be trained like a Navy SEAL, like whatever. Everyone should fight. No one should fight. So I think we find somewhere in the middle that's a really common basis. And to Brandon's point, how much do you train? So, we have a similar thought process, but we go about it differently, only because the way that school boards mandate these things usually is exactly what you said, some type of training. And what does that training look like? Well, some people don't want to include the children in the training because it's overload. It's too much, if you will. But to Brandon's point, how do you save, threefold the children if you don't include everyone? Basketball, football, excellent points of view. So my thought process is leading this, this new dimension and thought process really of we need to broaden our sales and scalability is we do it twice a year for the children and the whole school with some type of drill, but we don't go so far overboard, because I've read some of the questions that, we go back to my analogy. When you teach a firefighter how to fight a fire, you don't light them on fire to know it's hot, right? When police go to the range, they don't shoot each other to find out bullets or do terrible things. So there's no reason we should induce children to the extreme amount of stress that type of event would induce, because there is a PTSD factor. There is liability after that. I can name 4 case studies where the lawsuits were in the hundreds of millions because the wrong drill by the wrong people were done with simunition training or whatever, and it did an overload. So if we go backwards and scale it to exactly what are we talking about? Well, some police show up. Hey, kids, what are you doing when the police show up? And I'm not saying kids in 5th grade. I'm saying from kindergarten to, postgraduate level. Here's what's going to happen when law enforcement shows up. They're not going to be here during the incident. That's the first number that you need to know. The misnomer is police are not going to be here. And if you do have an SRO on scene, hopefully they're hunting for that shooter. And the people inside that event need to understand they're not coming to help that person. They're going to stop the killer or stop the carnage. How do you do that? By bypassing everybody else. And that takes a lot of training. So I think we need to identify who we want trained, how we want them trained, and what's the best way to train them without inducing some type of psychological trauma.
Jonathan, I mean, what types of regimen do you have in your district when it comes to training?
I think any of us can look at our organizations and you have a structural approach. So building on what Chris and Brandon have shared, I see some questions as well in Q&A, considering hybrid work models. Are we looking at the importance of our HR department in this entire process? We're focusing on response protocol. So not only is it important to have the proper response protocol that reflects the culture and the goals and strategies of each particular district that have hopefully been thought about from top down, and there's that feedback loop. But what are we doing to focus on those issues? HR is often overlooked in this process. So in a hybrid work environment, we need to make sure, are they at the table, right? This is about boundary spanning. Ultimately, it's inclusivity of all of our stakeholders in the community, as well as in a district or an institution, to inform the process and actually identify problems that we likely would have missed, such, in school districts right now, the substitutes, what's our key program for substitute teachers to get their door locked and unlocked? What type of locking mechanisms do you have? Are they aware of those protocols? Are we failing in that process, whether it's through HR or on the security and facilities side, to address what seems like a very simple issue, but could be a major weak link in our overall chain of how we mitigate. So look at things structurally, include the proper stakeholders, not just police, not just security, SRO personnel, but have a broad spectrum of expertise to be able to identify the problems as well as develop the solutions. That's how you're going to have a customized plan for each building and for each district, or at least the ability to build a more comprehensive plan.
Now, an interesting point. I mean, and this is directed to you, Brandon. So, when with regards to training, do you train elementary school students differently from middle, high school, college students? I mean, how is training differ from the age of the population?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So when you look at training, right, training has to be age and ability appropriate. We cannot have an unrealistic expectation to have a 5-year-old kindergarten student respond in the same manner that a 17-year-old high school senior would. Also, we have to look at one's ability, right? When we talk about your training and your option-based proactive strategies, if someone has, let's take a mobility, right? If there's a mobility restriction, then that somewhat changes that, not somewhat, that does change how we're able to train this individual. And so age and ability appropriate training is 100% important, right? To Chris's point, when to accomplish the goal of training, do we need to have people running around with simunitions and flashbangs and blanks in buildings? No. And so, you can certainly accomplish age and ability appropriate training, but you have to know what that is. What does that look like? And how do you reciprocate that within your organization?
Chris, I mean, going back to the Collierville, Texas Synagogue, what sort of training did they have? And were they employing red hide fight? I know that you mentioned their training was provided by FBI, but what sort of training did they have and apply during that situation?
Yeah, so synagogues join a broad span usually of one gentleman, cornered the market pretty much on this type of training. And it is partly run, hide, fight. It's some hybrids put together that are unique for that type of worship setting, because you do have a large open area. And we've seen from Sutherland Church and a couple other church shootings, and the synagogue shootings in 2017-18, that, some type of training was needed. So it was more of an active shooter course put together. I haven't seen the outline, but from what I've read today and over the past couple of days, it was based off of run, hide, fight, but actually tailored to that type of environment. And the one thing I'll say about run, hide, fight is that while it works great, and I think everyone knows by now, I'm implementing new factors to it to kind of build onto it, which is a prevention, response, and options method. They really went to the options method of, hey, we're going to do a little bit of prevention by talking and biding their time, a little bit of response by this is how we're going to do it and get people out, letting the professions go, and a few options where they used something out of some of the, correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon, but the older training models from Alice, picking things up and using them as an improvised weapon. They were, it goes across the board that way. But, luck was on their side, and, fortune favors the bold. So this rabbi did an incredible thing. The one thing I want to say about schools, I recognize the question in here, and I just want to address it real quick because it's time appropriate. It says, should fire drills be excluded from the active shooter training, or can you incorporate the two of them? And I can tell you that I've been involved reviewing a couple really bad incidents where the fire drill happened or a fire alarm happened during an active shooter event. And unfortunately, some kids ran right into that fire, and other kids that, tried to hide were ambushed, and other kids that tried to fight, or adults were, unfortunately injured or, deceased now. I'm not saying the model doesn't work. I'm saying it's the best thing we have, and we can incorporate other things. But something to consider is you have to know what your plan is. So if it's shelter in place, what does shelter in place look like? Do you have a ballistic shield to shelter behind? And then the resources will be, I'll add some for that. Do you have, are you going to fight? And if you're going to fight, who's going to fight? Do you have police officers that are coming to the call? And finally, if you are sheltering in place, you have contingencies in place for if there's an explosive device. So in Collierville, we saw they evacuated the whole area because the terrorists said, hey, we have explosive device in place. What are you going to do? So they evacuated the whole area. So if you find out there's a threat of a bomb inside your school, you don't lock the kids down in the school, you evacuate them. And that goes when we go into the linear mode of training, one problem at a time. We have the first problem, there's a bomb, let's get out. Second problem, we encounter a shooter, this is what we do. Third problem, we're in an open area environment, this is how we disperse. Special needs, who's tending to those? And we talked about that last time.
So how do you determine and communicate whether to shelter in place or evacuate? How is that determination made, and how do you get the word out?
Excellent question. So pre-planning is number one, and having a plan. And right now we see with Alyssa's law of panic buttons and locked doors and barriers and whatnot, they are determining that. And I've got a case study that, I teach quite often to just about everybody, which was the San Diego Medical Center at the naval base for Balboa Hospital. They had an active shooter in 2015 that wasn't, but in 5 messages in under 3 seconds, they communicated run, hide, fight, activate active shooter protocols, shelter in place, evacuate immediately, and follow fire alarm procedures. That's not the right time to come up with a plan. So once you incorporate that plan, it's just like a CEO hierarchy chart, right, with your board of directors and down. You come up with the plan that you're going to do. It's an active shooter. You find a way to alert the classrooms that it is an active shooter. We used to think phones and apps were the best. Well, what do kids do when they take tests? They shut their phones off and put them down. They're not going to be notified correctly. So that's part of Alyssa's law, trying to fix some of that. When the teachers make the decision they're going to lock down, they lock down and they don't open the door. And we learned that from Virginia Tech. And I mean, obviously there's way too many examples that we should be drawing, that we can draw from. My new motto is never here, like net zero, never here, right? Zero now. We don't want another one to discuss. We want to figure out how to solve that problem. And I think we're well on our way.
Jonathan, you have a thought on that?
And so undergirding all of this is communication, and part of this response, in our protocols, what are we doing throughout the year to test our public address systems or whatever systems that we've invested in? it could, on some campuses be as simple that part of it is actually in a small enough campus, word of mouth. But we want to have a multimodal approach. But are we testing that so that when it's time for a plan to go into action, it works? One of those examples, and we could share there's an after action report in Idaho, the Rigby Elementary School shooting, which could have ended up a lot more tragic, but some great lessons in a good report that we'll share. It ends up, they were in many K-12 systems know what these modulars are. And this could be a case on campus as well in different buildings that aren't part of the overall communication system. Their modulars did not have an emergency PA system inside. So that the school knew that an emergency was going on and word was sent, those teachers were actually having students traverse the space in which the shooter had set up like a sniper. Fortunately, things ended up much better than they could have been. But it's those simple lessons. What are we doing to step back, in leadership and be able to point to examples of what's actually happened? And let's hold that lens up to what our school district or our institution of higher education is practicing or prepared to practice.
Before we move on, I just want to remind the participants that you can ask. We already have a lot of questions coming in, but if you hit the Q&A button, you can ask questions for the panelists. We'll take your questions in just a minute. We have a number of questions that came in from your submissions on the before the webinar. So I'll start off with a couple questions that came in from first Daniel Martin from Middlesex Community College. Chris, you kind of alluded to this, but what is the best practice if a fire alarm is pulled during an active threat event?
So I think you kind of go, there's a famous SWAT saying, go wrong, stay wrong. So even if you're following the wrong protocol, it should get you to the place you want to go. And if something, in turn is grotesquely happening, fall back to that level of training. This is where we come full circle back to what Brandon said earlier and what Jonathan alluded to in his examples. Training every month. The body won't go where the mind has never been. How do you get it there? Well, you practice, and then practice some more. And the key here is know what you're practicing and make sure it's correct and accurate for the people that are involved. Back to Brandon's point again, age and ability. Can they do what you're asking them to do? Well, the number one thing is, for let's say my family, I won't say anyone else's family, for my family, I don't want them fighting in the active shooter and I don't want them hiding under a desk. Their number one goal is to get out of the premise and get out safely. And I can tell you a percentage that'll help. 97% of people who run from an active shooter survive without getting hit. Now there is that 3% chance, but 97 sure sounds better than 3. And how do you do that? By rehearsing how you're going to get out and knowing where you're going to go. If we follow that fire code, they usually have really great measures to get out. The problem of interior classrooms is, of course, long corridors that are man traps or woman traps, where if the shooter wanted to have their way or a shooter wanted to have their way, you have to have a backup plan or you have to have other training in place. Coming right back around to what? Training every month or training every other month and teaching those people what to do and how to do it.
So would you say run, hide, fight is the standard today, or what are the other options? And I know Brandon, Alice is certainly an approach. And what is this relationship with run, hide, fight?
Well, really quick, and I'll pass it to Brandon because I think he'll have a great input here. But run, hide, fight is fantastic, but you have to have premise behind it. Right now, it's an empty vessel. They're 3 words. They mean nothing. Go back to what Brandon alluded to earlier about losing children in schools. 63 years. It's been 63 years plus that we've lost a child in a school fire. How did we do that? And I mentioned this last time. We didn't buy more fire trucks and hire more firefighters. We started with prevention, and we sold that model and we sold it to the communities. If we have a prevention in place, you and I have talked about this before, we can cut school shootings by 50% today. And how is that? We know that 44.3% of all school shooters tell someone they're going to shoot. We have to learn how to translate that information back. There's almost 50% right there. Add a little bit of training, we're at 50% willingly. How do you get there? One day at a time. And it's a slow, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And that's how you go about this. So run, hide, fight is a good model. It's just kind of empty right now. We need to learn what prevention looks like within Run, Hide, Fight, what response looks like within Run, Hide, Fight, and what options look like within Run, Hide, Fight. And who are you talking to briefly? We have 4 Ps, right? The people, that's me inside an event. The place, am I in school, a mall, city hall, a school board meeting? The perpetrator, how do I know who the perpetrator is? The community knows the other 50% of the times. If you ever watch an event after it unfolds, what's the first person they find? The media finds, sir, what do you think? Well, we all knew this person was going to be a shooter. There's your other 50%. And then finally, the police. And if we recognize the police will not be there in the majority of incidents, then we understand that we have a duty to save our people, right, for lack of a better term, from these types of events by providing them options. And that's where I pass it to Brandon with, other alternatives, because there are several others.
Yeah. So, obviously, I support and work for Alice, right? And so when you talk about some of the differences, right? So Alice is really taking, some of that stuff that Chris talked about, right? Like, what does that really mean? What does that really look like? And so Alice, we not only were the tip of the spear. I mean, we were the first organization out in 2001 with proactive option-based strategies. And then we've taken it, and evolved over the last 20 years in what does age and ability appropriate look like? What does Run, Hide, Fight look like to that middle school student or that elementary school student or that high school student? What about our special ed department, right? What does training look like to life skills, to cognitive processing, right? So when you think about all of those gaps that you have to have answers for, that's what Alice is, right? Alice is able to take it from, a regular ed student to a special ed student, and really, not just, I'm using students because we're talking about schools, but across the board, right? It's just different when we get to adults, right? But really, what does that training really look like? And so Alice really is checking all the boxes in a really solid curriculum and training program.
Jonathan. Could I add one thing really quick, Jonathan? I apologize, just 1 minute. I'm seeing some of the comments come in, and I call this, willingly, the good ideas, and they're all great ideas. And the people that speak from authority, which is fantastic. Sometimes I speak from that position, and other people do too. The whole message that I have, whether it's Alice, Alert, Prevention Response Options, the PRO model, Run, Hide, Fight, ZeroNow, Jonathan School Board meeting, it doesn't matter. If we don't start incorporating all of the ideas, we're going to be stuck. Okay, and that's where we are right now. And that's what we're trying to break through with the tip of the spear of what we're doing from PRO. I've said this before. This is not a business model. I'm not trying to say this is the right way or the wrong way. This is a human model. This is how to save lives. And it's more important than a really good idea that's not a good idea or bickering over what's the best idea. My whole point and my whole basis for speaking about this is I've seen it from the inside of an event, and I'm not unique. There's a lot of people that have seen it from the inside of an event. I wrote a master's degree program on it. Now many people have. But I've also studied these things ad nauseum, and I'm like, 33 total years of this. It's going to take everyone's good ideas and then be mashed in a blender and then poured out with some suitable, digestible messaging. And if we don't have the ability to listen to each other, we're just going to talk over each other. And that's why we are open all the way across. I think all of us would agree. We are open to all good ideas. That's why I'm here for this webinar. I've been reading, and they're great comments, and I think we need to incorporate them.
And that's why we're here, Chris. I mean, that's the whole point of ZeroNow, is to have these conversations, to collaborate as a group of stakeholders, whether it's industry, education, individual advocates. That's the whole point of this, is let's work together to come up with better solutions. Mr. Kassa, I know you had a thought you wanted to share.
I like being a panelist just because I learned so much. It's not just about being able to pontificate. So I also appreciate those comments. And it's important for us to challenge ourselves in these models. So it's a constantly evolving field. And that's the one aspect, is that if we have people who are dedicated to understanding that change and embracing it, that no model is going to be static, we're going to have the best success as we move forward. I want to also clarify, correct me if I'm speaking for my panelists, if I'm presumptuous, but there's that mention of when we talk about a minimum standard, monthly or whatever we want it to be, it's about regular training. And it doesn't mean that that's regular training every single month with students. I think we have to have multiple approaches in different dimensions. It could be a training that could be just for cabinet leadership about resilience. What do you do after an event happens? Who's cleaning up the blood splatter? Who's patching holes in the walls? There's a lot of learning that can happen from leadership that they take away from that they can back out as well. Different types of tabletops and experiences. It doesn't mean subjecting staff and students, but it's certainly what is being reinforced by the expertise I hear, is that the professionals and those dedicated stakeholders in the process should be part of that regular activity, and setting that schedule up, which properly reflects the climate culture expectations of this response protocol in tandem with prevention. And this, also reminds me, we're talking about different models, and I've seen this before. There's red ball drills. It's a non-traumatic approach. It's from the bottom up, and it complements any of the models that we've been talking about. These are not training programs that just supplant one another. We could take and pick and pull what we want from each and have them work together for the strongest model moving forward. But I've been impressed seeing what's coming out. Red Ball Drills has a DHF Safety Act certification, and that's for a non-traumatic approach. What can we learn from that and bring into the process that strengthens the other models, which we're also discussing? Those people making comments today and that have questions, very interested to learn what models that they can suggest also that we can continue to learn from. So thank you.
Along those lines, Kelly from BOCES asked, how can information be shared for active shooter drills without causing harms to students and staff? And somebody in the Q&A in the chat asked something about too, when dealing with anxious children. How do you go about doing this without adding additional anxiety and concern with students and staff?
So I think there's a number of ways to do this, right? Depending on resources and what resources you have, there's age appropriate materials that speak to a student or a young person on a particular age and or grade level. Right. So what resources do you have? Also, when you think about the teacher in the classroom, especially at that elementary age, that young student looks to and admires that teacher, right? So and I'll go back to a word that I used a lot in our first webinar, right? That relationship will help be able to bridge the gap. Now, again, we have to make sure it's appropriate and how the terminology we use and how we talk about it. But just from a place of standard of having the conversation, right? Again, some of that is going to be used on that relationship because that student, is looking to that teacher every single day. And that teacher is leading that. And so that relationship is really, really key. And then there's the resources, right? What resources are we using to help foster the conversation, right? Because the fact of the matter is, not every educator is deep rooted in this conversation, like some of others are. And so, for them, it's about getting an understanding and then being able to take that understanding and use the age and ability appropriate delivery method to have that conversation and the training. And so I think that's kind of a twofold approach is one from a self-awareness and understanding, and then how can I now deliver it to my age or ability appropriate student, so that we can have the conversation without the traumatic experience.
Kelvin Gilmore from Greensboro College asks, can you please explain the best role for unarmed campus security department during an active shooter event? As we know, many campuses don't have sworn officers. They're campus safety officials. So what role do they play during an active shooter event?
So if you don't mind, I'll take this one, Brandon and Jonathan. The events that I've seen, I would say it's 50-50. The ones that I've studied either have school resource officers or they don't. And I'm specifically speaking K through 12. And the ones that don't have more of a shepherd role. And the goal is, let's go backwards to our conversation we just had. What is the role that we are choosing, as Jonathan, eloquently put it? Which one are we going to supplant into the method? Are we going to stay in place? Are we going to initiate some fire drills? Are we going to get out, as I spoke about, as Brandon was talking about, with some of the ALS procedures? Once you pick the one you're going to do, you have to kind of stick with it and train through it. Then ask somebody to come evaluate it. And the evaluations aren't that expensive, because the return on regret or the return on prevention can't really be measured. But I can tell you it will be if an event happens and it goes wrong. And to that point, I'm not going to step on, but there's one question here that we wanted to get to about current data, and it's from Sarah. What's the most substantial and important thing to know coming from recent data, research, et cetera? And I think it's important to say, it'll take about 1 minute. When we started the beginning of 2021, before that, my group, the Shooter Prevention Project, people that are associated with that, and the first preventers sat down with some FBI people, retired, and we predicted that there would be between 3 and 5 incidents going into 2021. And sure enough, it kicked off with the Asian day spa, the grocery store shooting in Colorado, the FedEx shooting. And they compounded. So we were within a couple, which isn't a bragging thing. It was more of a, what were we looking at? Obnoxious predictions or facts. And the facts is data. And we call them, like right now, what are the contributing factors coming down for 2020? From 2020. And these are lockdowns. We talked about domestic violence before, unreported opioid abuse, unreported other violent factors. And these schools are like the clearinghouse for these things, to where we can get the message out. And with the return of children coming, I think it's really important, while we are on the same topic of active shooters and whatnot, we still need to be involved in how do we talk to and reach each individual child without causing them trauma, going back to the question that prompted this, right? So we don't want to desensitize the children after something terrible happens. And we don't want to desensitize them to the importance of what's happening. But we do fire drills like it's nothing and nobody's scared of them, where fire is a gory, graphic thing to happen if you've seen it in person. So how do we do that? We find that fine line for each individual district, teacher, and figure out a way to translate that to the children. Thank you.
Speaking of being desensitized, Matt Frank asked if we could talk about some of the recent threats made on TikTok and how that and everything else seems to be desensitizing the public to these threats. Do you have thoughts on that, Jonathan?
Well, from a district experience, we're one of the largest districts in Pennsylvania. I think many other districts, no matter size, have had to deal with this, and hopefully they have over the last few months, but certainly throughout the pandemic, right? Social media abhors a vacuum. It will be filled with gossip, increasing, rhetoric, and will create a cascade of problems that no administrator will be able to handle, or communications expert. So are we prepared as part of our response protocol, right? It's all tied together, these protocols of prevention and response. Are we prepared for when an incident happens that we already have templates, or we've already figured out what it is we're going to communicate, who can do it when, frequency, that right, reunification, how that all fits together. But in regards to social media, some of the TikTok challenges and other threats which have occurred, the fact is, if you're not monitoring social media, even at the most nominal level as a district or an institution, you're increasing your risk, not only for a threat to actually visit, but for ultimately, what is it when we manage risk that we're trying to do? You want a continuity of operations. And if you let that social media get out ahead of your narrative as a district, that this is a safe place, this is the information that we've learned, this is what we've learned from our federal and state partners, and share that as soon as possible, and to not sit on that information and be transparent, you're not only helping in that situation, you're building trust in the future for when it really matters. Once again, creating that feedback loop that see something, say something, confidence that there's going to be a response from the school or the institution, and this all flows together in the same prevention and response direction.
It's sad. It reminds me of last month when the Detroit shooting, and my daughter called. She's a student at American University, and I asked her if she heard the news. She said, "Yeah, it's happening all the time. I mean, we're desensitized as a student body. We're desensitized to this, and getting ahead of that, and not allowing us to be desensitized, but knowing how to keeping it, being serious about it, and being prepared and knowing how to respond is absolutely critical. We can't let that deteriorate that ability to do so." Any final thoughts on that before I move on to some additional questions? And please continue to send these in here. Okay, let's see here. This is tied into this as well. Sarah asks, Marie Baumgardner, do you think the social environment and social media influences have an impact on response plans, and how often review the plan? So is that of concern?
I'm going to take a stab at the very beginning of this and pass it. I think Brandon will have some good input, as well as Jonathan. But this is where the lack of salesman ability from the Chris Grollneck comes, right? These things sell themselves. I'm not on here selling anything, but I'll tell you, you can see from what you alluded to are about the TikTok challenge about bring a gun to school, create violence, who's going to be the next school shooter. Those challenges are happening right now. The FBI has arrested I mentioned this last time, 2 14-year-old girls in different states in the past 6 months, less than that had plans to shoot up schools. With the anniversary of Parkland coming up in a couple of weeks, with the anniversary of, unfortunately, the Adolf Hitler birthday, with the anniversary of Columbine, there's a lot of things that pour into these things. So getting straight to the guts of what Jonathan was saying and the specific targeted training that Brandon has rolled out and talked about, I'd say once you have a solid plan and you believe in your plan should sustain the force of the storm. Just like a hurricane building, right? We build it to be hurricane proof. Even if F5 comes, we're going to lose some shingles, but we're not going to lose the building. The same thing. Once you put in a plan and you're confident that your plan's working because you're confident you've done enough drills, that should be your benchmark to ask one another on the school boards and as district providers all the way up to the president that says, have we had enough drills and are we ready if something goes wrong? And show me what that looks like. Getting back to the Brandon view of, do you do a whole incident critical review? To my point of don't scare the bejesus out of everybody while doing it, to Jonathan's point, is it thoroughly thought through and who knows about it and who's pushing it? And I remember back from the last webinar, Jonathan asked, what's your budget? Show me your budget. Show me, are you serious about this? If you're serious, you're ready. If you're not, a prayer doesn't work in the middle of chaos. That's the one takeaway I hope everyone gets from this.
So, I mean, how effective, we talk about training and when to train students and how properly to train students based on their age appropriateness. How effective are tabletop exercises, and should schools, should college campuses, K through 12, be engaged in tabletop exercises with other stakeholders and for the safety of that institution, with local police, first responders, and how often should they be engaged in tabletop exercises? Who wants to take that one?
I have a quick opinion on that, and I really want to learn from my fellow panelists. Tabletops are great, but we need to be thoughtful in the approach and how they're done. Often it's just your leadership It's not informed by the people on the ground who have to react accordingly. So it's one thing to have that tabletop with your executives and to get their attention. And that's important. I don't want to attack tabletops, but I find that far too often that information and what is done, that's a practice. We aren't dealing with from the bottom up what's occurring at the grassroots level of our employees and our staff who not only realize what the actual problems are and can help square that with policy and practice, but they're also most likely to come up with solutions. So we don't want to have an over-reliance on tabletops. We have to make sure that we're including in that feedback loop, including the voices of those who actually have to respond. So it's good at a policy and a strategy level, but I don't think that we don't want to have an over-reliance on it.
Brandon or Chris, thoughts on the tabletop approach?
Yeah, John stole about half of what I was going to comment. So, spot on. I just think that, I find a lot of times tabletops have become a check the box, right? Let's get something done to say we got it done, to meet whatever our mandate is to say we got it done, and we can check the box. And it doesn't, to John's point, doesn't require a lot of people. Therefore, it doesn't require a lot of disruption of the operation. And so we can get it in. So to John's point again, right? What's the mindset of the leadership? If it's just, let's just fit it in and kind of make it work and get it done to check the box, then ultimately, as the saying goes, right, you get what you pay for. But I won't spend a lot more time being redundant to what John said, because most of his comments were exactly what I was going to say.
Chris,
I'm just going to end that with, it's been my experience that tabletop exercises end up in the 3-ring binder of, the abyss. We do the tabletop exercise, and people get embarrassed and they don't want to be embarrassed, so they put it in their 3-ring binder and they put it on the shelf. Or the people say, we don't want to spend that money, put that back away. This never happened. We were never here. And the problem with that is, of course, you are identifying the weaknesses and the gaps, and you can also identify. Most people address. It's like anybody else that's a naysayer. There's 99 really good things, and they hear that one bad thing, and then all their focus is on one bad thing. We need to address the things at a 50-50 rate. 50% of these things are great. 50% of these things might not be so great. How do we make them all just a good thing that's standardized and make one simple thing? Back to your point, you're not going to get an unarmed school security officer to be able to shepherd an entire building, let alone whole school or district, without a tabletop exercise to understand where your weaknesses are. The problem is what your spend is. What are you getting for your spend? If you're spending money just to find out a weakness, you're chasing the wrong thing. If you're spending money just to find out your strengths, you're spending money on the wrong thing. You want a holistic tabletop, someone that can do them and provide really good feedback and bring the stakeholders in from the bottom up, to Jonathan's point and to Brandon's point. Make sure the plan is inclusive for training, that has an end objective of, we're going to train the corrections from the tabletop, or they're moot.
You mentioned unarmed safety. Someone did ask, should teachers be armed? Does anybody want to address that? No, that's. I'm going
to go really quick. I have a favorite saying, and I'm done. As a police officer, I believe nobody really needs a gun, and as a citizen, I believe everyone needs 10. Right? Because constitutional, it's whatever you want it to be. It doesn't have to be a left or right exercise. The problem with guns in classes are, if you have the training more than 40 hours a year, or 50 rounds twice a year, or once every other year, and you really can facilitate the training, good. But I'd implore you, send me an email, or I'll provide it. I have a video from, I think it was Court TV back in the day, a very seasoned SWAT team, armed to the teeth, dressed down in the middle of the shooting. Everything went wrong. 9 of the SWAT team ran one way, and 1 person faced the music. So 1 out of 10 times you're going to get it right, and that's just a good basis based on a lot of data. It's just a visualization to help you understand it might not always be a good idea to have a gun.
Thanks, Chris. On that note, so it's something new after the session today. We're going to send out some key takeaways via email that highlights some of these points, provides additional resources and some contact information for our panelists if you want to follow up with them, and or if you're interested in becoming a part of ZeroNow and becoming part of this conversation, because this is truly a collaborative initiative, stakeholders working together to solve these challenges. We've got time maybe for one, maybe two more questions. So Paul Friedman, hi Paul, asked, should every space in a school have a tiny camera that can be turned on in a crisis in order to identify where a shooter is and track that person as they move throughout the school? Has any school tried this? So thoughts on surveillance, I guess for the prevalence of surveillance on a school or campus?
I'll take a stab really quick. When you have mass surveillance and then a number of cameras, if you don't have somebody manning those 100% of the time, you're going to lose accurate data. And it's Michigan, back through Parkland, all the way to Columbine. When, back in 99, before we had cell phones that had cameras on them, now you are a walking camera. You'll learn more from Jonathan's point from social media happening in real time than you will going back to look at the cameras, because just look at some of the open records reports from one of the most recent shootings. And I say most recent, within a few years, they were tracking the shooter still inside the school 23 minutes after the shooter had left. So it's not real-time intelligence always. And what you think is real might not be. So you're going to have to rely on basically your best reporting sources, which are the, in this case, children in classrooms with their cell phones posting to social media.
If I might add, to this, and it's a question I see Kelly had about social media from one of the earlier answers as well. What platforms exist and technologies? So there are multiple types of platforms that can be invested in, many different price points, but that also protect, that follow constitutional law. That's been settled regarding the technology, but also can provide a filter to alert authorities to the risks that they set. So there's those technologies themselves. We can have a discussion offline between us what to share, how to share that with the team. But it's also as simple as this comes down to budget showing priority. Do you have a CSO? Is there a director or coordinator of safety and security or someone in that role that at least has ownership of setting a simple Google feed for certain keywords? And you could share with others, part of that is talking to other professionals. We're more than open to share in this field what some of those settings might be. There's also reaching out sometimes, and perhaps Brian and Chris could speak to fusion centers, but I know there's also your county that could be a resource who might invest in some of these platforms as well for all districts, and the very systems that they might have as well. The key in all of this is sustainability and having someone who's actually responsible within your district to begin that process and to be a champion. And that will evolve along the way, depending on the type of resources that can be allocated.
And to tag on that, real quick, I didn't mean to say that cameras don't work. What I was saying is sometimes we get them in different positions and we rely on them as if they're the end all be all, and they are a part of the effort to stop these things, and they must be. And the technologies that exist today are well worth the investment. The problem is, again, are you going, not a problem, but a solution or the problem, are you going to train with them, and what are you going to train them to do?
On that note, Jason Friedberg mentioned something in the chat here about cameras. And there's one thing just to have static cameras that are monitoring and really used for forensics after the incident, but there are video analytics with artificial intelligence that can be utilized today that are constantly monitoring for weapons, for aggression, for other factors that can be used to automate the entire process once that happens. So when it comes to having cameras everywhere, that's one thing, but making sure those cameras are intelligent, they're actually doing something, they're actually being proactive in preventing harm rather than being reactive after the fact to identify what happened and do your research on a forensic basis. So good point on that. Any final thoughts before we wrap things up here? We have a couple more questions, but I don't think we'll be able to get to any more questions. So, like I mentioned, we will be sending out a key points, key takeaways after this. So, anything we didn't get to, we'll certainly follow up. Any final thoughts? We'll start with Brandon, and then Chris, and then Jonathan.
Sure. I just want to say thanks again for the opportunity. I think it's important that we keep having these conversations, right? We keep, using the bandwidth of information that's out there to try to address, prevent, respond, recover from these individuals who quite frankly are in they're in the minority, right? They're a small number of population, but I think I'm just thankful for the opportunity to be on the panel, to, as Johnson said, right, to kind of go through and catch up on some of the conversation that's happening in chat and Q&A, and still be involved and attentive to the panel. So thanks for the opportunity, and hopefully we continue to have the conversation so that we are putting folks in a much better position.
Definitely. Thank you, Brandon. Mr. Grollneck.
Thank you all for the opportunity. Humbled to be here. Just remember the audience, everyone. I mean, my one takeaway is what I said earlier. Don't be closed-minded. Use all the good, bad, and other, kind of mash it together and see what works for you. Reach out. There's a lot of free resources out there, good advice, some not so good. And reach out to a couple of prevention experts that are, the mouthpieces of prevention and response and of options and different models of prevention and this type of training. Like Brandon said, they're the minority of what's happening in the world right now. But when they happen, boy, you'd think it rained, evil that day. And those are the things that I say, return on regret. You can do it. Return on prevention. Thanks so much, Brandon. I appreciate you, Jonathan. Thank you as always, Unarmed. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And Mr. Kassa, final thoughts.
Thank you for everyone that is here and participated. You're here because you care. We don't need to preach to that choir. We're all going to get outside of the fence because of you, and that's how we're going to get to ZeroNow and make our schools and colleges and universities safer. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. This was a great discussion, and I'm glad that we decided to continue this on. Just so the folks that are watching this know, our next session is on February 15th. We're kind of be switching gears here, focusing on cybersecurity. So protecting campuses from cyber threats. We're going to have some great panelists for that. So be sure to register for that. After this, you'll be receiving a post-event survey. Please let us know how we're doing, and let us know what, of course my phone rings, let us know what you would like us to discuss. And most importantly, consider being a part of this group, being part of ZeroNow as a member, as a institution, as a higher education institution, or K through 12 as a technology company, or as an individual. We love to be part of this. The whole point here is to work together to address these issues so we can come up with better solutions. So appreciate your time. Keep an eye out. Please fill out that post-event survey, and we will see you next month. Thanks, everybody. Take care.